And this is the benefit of talk radio and the long-form format. We're going to do something a little different this evening. I always do, but this is especially so. The question I am posing to you, the American people, is whether the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, is a traitor to the United States. Not just a misguided ideologue, not just an Obama slug, but look all over the world. Look at Afghanistan. Look at Russia and Ukraine. Look at China, poised to attack Taiwan. He's a special pleader for terrorists in the Middle East, the Islamonazi regime in Tehran, the Islamonazi regime in Gaza, the Islamonazi regime in the Palestinian territories. He's in the Middle East right now, spending all of his effort character assassinating the government of Israel. And today he said something that is even beyond the pale, that the Jews were dehumanized on October 7th, and they shouldn't dehumanize the Palestinians. Antony Blinken has thwarted a deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel, a peace deal that would have occurred within a month of Donald Trump's reelection. And now Saudi Arabia is saying no peace unless there's a two-state solution. The Israeli people don't want a two-state solution because they know it's their final solution. And it's remarkable, given the fact that Antony Blinken is responsible for the hiring of an Iranian spy ring in the United States, led by one of his childhood friends, Robert Malley, who's had his classification pulled, and the administration refuses to tell Congress exactly what happened. Now, in the Senate, of course, the Democrats don't care. They're the Praetorian Guard for traitors, for spies, for illegal immigrants, and everything else. The Republicans in the House are having a hell of a time getting any information. And Iran is on the precipice of a nuclear weapon, and I will get to that because a well-respected organization has just announced and put out a report that Iran's potential achievement, finally, of a nuclear weapon is at the quote-unquote extreme danger phase. And Blinken is in the Middle East attacking the only country, the only one that has stood up to Iran and tried to stop them. Certainly Biden has not. So the question on the table that I want you to think about, is Antony Blinken a traitor? Is he the new Alger Hiss? Is that what's going on in our country? In my view, it sure as hell seems so. So we're going to take this step by step, America, because this involves our security, this involves our allies, this involves the lives of Americans, and potentially American soldiers, 3 of whom have already died. And we're going to start tonight with a speech that John McCain gave on the floor of the Senate when Blinken was nominated for Deputy Secretary of State in the Obama administration. We've broken it into 3 parts. We'll do the best we can to keep it flowing. Got one, go.
Madam President, I rise to discuss my opposition to the pending vote concerning Mr. Tony Blinken, who is not only unqualified, but in fact, in my view, one of the worst selections of a very bad lot that this president has chosen. I hope that many of my colleagues will understand that not often do I come to the floor to oppose a nomination of the President of the United States because I believe that elections have consequences. In this case, this individual has actually been dangerous to America and to the young men and women who are fighting and serving it. Mr. Blinken has been a foreign policy advisor to Vice President Biden since his days in the Senate. But as Robert Gates has noted, Mr. Biden has been, quote, wrong on nearly every major foreign policy and national security issue over the past 4 decades. At the Special Operations Fund annual meeting on May 6, 2013, Mr. Blinken discussed a number of the administration's achievements, including 1, ending the war in Iraq responsibly, 2, setting a clear strategy and date for the withdrawal from Afghanistan, 3, decimating al-Qaeda's senior leadership, and 4, repairing our alliances and restoring America's standing in the world. That is as Orwellian as any statement I have ever heard. Each and every issue, the conditions are a far cry from the so-called achievements that Mr. Blinken describes. In his capacity as an assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor, Mr. Blinken has been a functionary and an agent of a U.S. foreign policy that has made the world much less safe today. Let's just review some of the elements in particular and Mr. Blinken's role in conceptualizing and furthering it. U.S. foreign policy is in a shambles. It's at best a strategic and at worst anti-strategic. It lacks any concept of how to obtain our foreign policy goals. This has led to countless foreign policy failures, including the continued slaughter of the Syrian people by President Bashar al-Assad, the Russian reset that culminated in President Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the betrayal of our key allies, especially in Central Europe, not to mention Israel, failing to achieve a status of force agreement that would help to maintain Iraq's security and stability, following similarly unwise strategies in Afghanistan. We will see the same movie in Afghanistan that we saw in Iraq if we have a date-driven withdrawal rather than a status-driven, conditions-driven situation, and our feckless position in negotiations with Iran on nuclear weapons that has failed to produce any progress towards an agreement. I could go into many other failures, such as the vaunted Geneva Convention of 40 nations that was supposed to help arrange for the transition from power from Bashar Assad, the abject failure of the Israeli-Palestinian peace talks, and what will be either an imminent failure of Iranian nuclear weapons agreement or an agreement that will be disastrous in the long run. There are two common sayings by the administration officials, not me, that have defined the president's approach to foreign policy: leading from behind and, quote, don't do stupid stuff. These approaches have resulted in a failed foreign policy that has made America and Americans less safe. Even President Obama's most strident supporters have begun to question the president's foreign policy decisions. In an article titled "Damage to Obama's Foreign Policy Has Been Largely Self-Inflicted," the Washington Post's David Ignatius, a key supporter of the administration's foreign policy goals, wrote that, quote, at key turning points in Egypt and Libya during the Arab Spring in Syria, in Ukraine, and yes, in Benghazi, the administration was driven by messaging priorities rather than sound interest-based policy. So what has Mr. Blinken had to say about all of these issues, my friends? Let me give you a few. On Iraq, at the Center for American Progress on March 16, 2012, now I'm not making this one up, Mr. Blinken said, quote, what's beyond debate is that Iraq today is less violent, more democratic, and more prosperous, and the United States more deeply engaged there than at any time in recent history. Less violent, more democratic, and more prosperous. At a White House briefing on March 16, 2012, Mr. Blinken said, and all these are quotes, President Obama and Vice President Biden come to office with this commitment to end the Iraq war responsibly. Both parts of that sentence are critical. End the war responsibly. Under the leadership of President Obama and Vice President Biden, who the president asked to oversee our Iraq policy, has made 8 trips to Iraq since being elected, we followed that path to the letter. And he went on to say, quote, at every step along the way, many predicted that the violence would return and Iraq would slide backward toward sectarian war. Get this, he said, those predictions proved wrong. Over the past 3 years, he went on to say, over the past 3 years, violence has declined and remains at historic lows, even after we completed the drawdown of U.S. forces late last year. Remember, he said this in 2012. Weekly security incidents fell from an average of 1,600 in 2007, 2008 to fewer than 100 today. Then he went on to say, and in December, after more than 8 wrenching years, President Obama kept his promise to end the war responsibly. And while Iran and Iraq will inevitably be more entwined than we and many of its neighbors would like, he went on to say, one thing we learned over more than 8 years in Iraq is that the vast majority of its leaders, including the Prime Minister, who at that time was Prime Minister Maliki, are first and foremost Iraqi nationalists and resistance to outside influence from anywhere, starting with Iran. Everybody knows the Iranians are probably the most influential nation in Iraq, certainly under Maliki. In foreign policy on December 27, 2013, he said, if we still had troops in Iraq today, the numbers would have been very small. They would not have been engaged in combat. That would not have been their mission. So the idea that they could or would have done something about the violence that's going on now in Iraq seems to me detached from the reality of what the mission would have been had they stayed in any small number.
This is very, very important to follow this. How much time do I have left in this segment, Mr. Producer? So we're going to take a break now, and we'll try and pick up after. It'll be a little bit staccato, just because of the nature of the commercial breaks. But I need you to listen to the whole thing, because I'm telling you a story about a man who I consider a traitor, an incompetent ideologue that is dragging our country into war and destroying our allies, that is arming up our enemies, effectively arming up our enemies with tens of billions of dollars, and doing absolutely nothing to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, which they will have. The only country that has done anything to try and prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon in the last 3 years is Israel. And he's trying to destroy Israel. He's character assassinating Israel when he goes to the Middle East. He's trying to get these so-called moderate Arab states to break their alliances with Israel, to make demands of Israel. He's met with Abbas, who's a Holocaust-denying terrorist, telling Abbas that he wants to turn over 30% of Israel to him. This is a disaster. He's not only a traitor, I suggest that he might even be the Alger Hiss of modern era. We really don't know, because the Senate won't hold any hearings. The House has held very few hearings on this man. And the Democrats are defending him. The media are defending him. The Washington Post has a special pleader for him, Thomas Friedman. But I don't care. We'll be right back.
Mark Levin.
In the last few days, Antony Blinken has gone to the Middle East. He's met with the inbred who runs Qatar, who is protecting right now 3 multi-billionaire Hamas leaders. Qatar, which was one of the great funders of Hamas and terrorism, to put pressure on Israel. Not to put pressure on Iran, not to build a coalition against a nuclearized Iran, against Israel. He met with Abbas for the second or third time, who is a terrorist, who funded the terrorist attack against the Israeli Olympians in 1972, denies the existence of the Holocaust, and announced 48 hours ago that any government that he would oversee would include Hamas, the Islamic Jihad, and other quote-unquote resistors. Antony Blinken met with him today. Antony Blinken, while in an Arab country, announced that while the Jews were dehumanized on October 7th, the Jews need to be careful not to dehumanize the Palestinians. That is pretty sick. In fact, that is contemptible. And he's done more and he has said more. This man is a traitor. He has led the effort to fund Iran. He has made excuses for Iran. He's a special pleader for Iran. He hired a man, Robert Malley, who is, in so many ways, like his father, an Iranian regime mouthpiece, who in turn hired three people, at least three people, one of whom was having regular backdoor communications with the regime in Iran. Malley himself was quickly removed. His classification was removed. It's a big secret. We don't know about it. Because in my view, there was some kind of spy ring taking place here. So he's not only a traitor. This is analogous to Alger Hiss. And he doesn't even speak up about Iran and the nuclear weapon. You're going to wake up one day and they're going to say, okay, we got our nuke. More when I return. All right, let's pick up where we left off with McCain on the floor of the Senate exposing the traitor. In my view, the modern-day Alger Hiss. Antony Blinken, go.
Now, you don't have to take my word for it. Take the word of Secretary Gates, Secretary Panetta, Ambassador Crocker, and any knowledgeable person about Iraq. And I will insert their quotes for the record, including Ambassador Crocker, who said, of course we could have left a residual force behind. Both Panetta and Gates both said the same thing. And at no time was there a public statement by the President of the United States or Mr. Blinken that they wanted to very seriously. In fact, they trumpeted the fact when the last American troop at that time, now we have many back, but when they left, bragging about what a great day that it was. On Fox News with Chris Wallace, September 28, 2014, Wallace, finally, President Obama spoke to the UN this week, but I want to ask you about his speech to the UN saying General Assembly last year, in which he said we were ending a decade of war. How could the president have been so wrong? Blinken, the president was exactly right. The president was exactly right. What we're doing is totally different than the last decade. We're not sending hundreds of thousands of American troops back into Iraq or Afghanistan or anywhere else. We're not going to be spending trillions of American dollars. Wallace, Mr. Blinken, he said all our troops have left Iraq. In fact, he has just sent at least 1,600 troops back into Iraq. He said we've dismantled the core of al-Qaeda, and yet the Khorasan group, which you struck in the first day, is an offshoot of the core of al-Qaeda, and in fact follows the direct orders of the leader of al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri. Blinken, Chris, they fled because we were so successful.
Keep playing, but you see, ladies and gentlemen, what McCain is pointing out is these are pathological liars who are lying about what's taking place and lying about what they've done.
At the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace on October 30th, 2014, the White House sought to leave a limited residual force in Iraq, but the Iraqi government simply refused to agree to legal protections for such troops, said then Deputy National Security Advisor Tony Blinken, who argued the final decision to withdraw all U.S. troops was not the result of a failure to negotiate. Quote, it's something we worked very hard, he said, but after a 10-year occupation, the Iraqi body politic did not want us to stay in Iraq. That's what happened. We were focused on acting on ISIL and the threat that it posed more than a year before the fall of Mosul. But the problem began to outrun the solution, fueled by the conflict in Syria, Iraqi reluctance, and renewed sectarianism in Iraq in advance of elections with politicians on all sides playing to their bases. You know, I mean, this statements like these, I mean, they're so divorced from reality. One can.
They're such friggin' liars about everything, whether it is the border, whether it is Trump, whether it is the economy. And he's pointing out, look what they're lying about in the Middle East. Go ahead.
And by the way, here's what Ryan Crocker said on Iraq. We got the other one. As a quote, as a former ambassador to Iraq 2007-2009, do you think it was a mistake not to push hard for the status of force agreement with Iraq before the U.S. pullout? I would remind my colleagues, Ryan Crocker, probably the most respected member of our diplomatic corps in America alive today. He said, I do. We could have gotten that agreement if we'd have been a little more persistent, flexible, and creative. But what really cost us was the political withdrawal. We cut off high-level political.
The political withdrawal. Everything about Biden now, foreign policy is about politics. It's about Dearborn, Michigan. That's what it's about. Dearborn, Michigan.
One visit prior to this current crisis, mainly to lecture the Iraqis on how bad they were being for facilitating Iranian weapons systems to Syrian President Bashar Assad. And we left them to their own devices, knowing that left to their own devices, it would not work out well. So you have Mr. Blinken's comments and juxtapose them with those of Ambassador Crocker. Here's what Leon Panetta, Democrat, Secretary
All right,
of Defense said.
let's phase this out. The poor guy's trying to make the case against Blinken. He makes an overwhelming case against Blinken that he's a liar, a fraud, a fool, that he's dangerous to America, he's dangerous to our troops, he's dangerous to our allies, even points out Israel, points out Ukraine. And say what you will about John McCain, in that speech he was absolutely 100% prescient. Prescient. Now I want you to hear the Prime Minister of Israel. Believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, he's the elected chief executive and commander-in-chief of a country called Israel. Blinken wasn't elected. Biden wasn't elected. Thomas Friedman wasn't elected. Joe Scarborough wasn't elected. Netanyahu was, which is why they trash him, try to destroy him, try to imprison him, lie about him, libel him. Because what they're really doing, while they're focused on him, they're really focused on the Jews in Israel. This is the way they hide their anti-Semitism. This is the way Sanders and Tlaib and self-hating Jews like Friedman hide their anti-Semitism, their hate for the state of Israel. Now I want you to listen to Netanyahu today via a translator. Go ahead, Mr. Medusa.
Now, for the day after, I would like to clarify that the day after is the day after Hamas. Not part of the Hamas, not half Hamas, but the entire Hamas. And I said to the Secretary of State, Blinken, that after we eliminate them, we will ensure that the Gaza Strip will be demilitarized forever. There is only one strength and power that can ensure that demilitarization. It is only the State of Israel and the IDF. They will act wherever and at any time that is necessary so that the terror will not be visible once again.
This is Churchill. This is Churchill, modern-day Churchill, who's standing up to Iran, to the terrorists, the Islamists, and unfortunately, the United States President, Secretary of State, and the United States Department of State. He's the only one. Go ahead.
One will be able to continue financing terror and teaching their children such hatred. Yes, we will have to exchange UNRWA and bring other people in their place. And I spoke to the Secretary of State about that. We are standing at a historic turning point. Either we could go towards light or towards
Is this the full speech or not, Rich? We'll go to the full speech. Let's do it.
Tonight I want to speak to you about total victory. Our security and the prospects of peace in the Middle East depend on one thing: total victory over Hamas. At the start of the war, I outlined 3 goals: destroy Hamas, free the hostages, and ensure that Gaza doesn't pose a threat to Israel anytime in the future. Achieving these goals will ensure Israel's security and pave the way for additional historic peace agreements with our Arab neighbors. But peace and security require total victory over Hamas. We cannot accept anything else. Can you imagine what will happen if we don't have total victory? Hamas leaders have already pledged they'll repeat the October 7th massacre over and over and over again. No nation can accept that. We certainly won't. Without total victory, Iran and its terror proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and others, will be emboldened to subvert moderate states in the Middle East. They'll threaten the entire free world. Only total victory will prevent that. And total victory is within our reach. Israel's military achievements are truly unprecedented. As John Spencer, head of urban warfare at West Point, noted, it took the United States and its allies 9 months to defeat ISIS in Mosul. Mosul is a single city smaller than Gaza, doesn't have any terror tunnels, and it had only 5,000 terrorists. Yet in 4 months, the IDF has killed, wounded, or captured over 20,000 terrorists, more than half of Hamas's fighting force. We've shattered 18 out of 24 Hamas battalions, and we're mopping up the remaining terrorists with ongoing raids. Our soldiers are systematically destroying the massive underground terror tunnels. Hamas believed this was an impregnable network. Yet our brave soldiers are now physically inside these tunnels. They're demolishing rocket factories, weapon stockpiles, command and control centers, and what Hamas thought were unreachable safe houses. Now I have to tell you, we were repeatedly told by many in the international community that all this simply couldn't be done. They said that a ground offensive would not be effective, that we couldn't enter Gaza City because it would be an abominable death trap, that we couldn't go into the hospitals that served as Hamas headquarters without inflicting massive civilian casualties, and that we couldn't enter the underground terror tunnels because nobody could. Yet our brave soldiers proved them all wrong on all counts. Many also argued that Israel's military campaign would scuttle our ability to release the hostages. Well, they were wrong on this one too. Military pressure led to the release of 110 hostages, and only continued military pressure will bring home the remaining hostages. Our soldiers are now in Khan Yunis, Hamas's main stronghold. They'll soon go into Rafah, Hamas's last bastion. They will do so, as they've done up to now, by providing the civilian population safe passage to safe zones. And they'll do so in spite of Hamas's evil attempts to stop the civilians from leaving at gunpoint. Total victory over Hamas will not take years. It will take months. Victory is within reach. And when people talk about the day after, let's be clear about one thing. It's the day after all of Hamas is destroyed. Not half of Hamas, not 3/4 of Hamas, all of Hamas. And once Hamas is destroyed, we need to verify that Gaza is demilitarized, that we stamp out any attempt at the resurgence of terror. And history has shown that only Israel can do this by having overriding security control over Gaza. What does that mean? It means that Israel will be in Gaza or act in Gaza at any place, at any time that is necessary to ensure that terrorism doesn't rear its ugly head again. Gaza must have a civilian administration staffed with those who do not support terrorism, fund terrorism, or indoctrinate their children with terrorism in the goal of destroying Israel. In fact, we should seek the very opposite, that school children in Gaza will be educated towards peace, that they'll be educated towards coexistence. Now, grant you, this will take time. But we've seen it happen in other parts of the world and in the Gulf states themselves. We would welcome the participation of moderate Arab states in creating a different and better future for Gaza. This would also require that UNRWA, which perpetuates the Palestinian refugee problem, whose schools indoctrinate Palestinian children with genocide and terror, and from whose ranks sprang a dozen terrorist murderers who participated in the October 7th massacre, this UNRWA must be replaced by responsible aid agencies. We're at a pivot of history where the region can go either in the direction of light or in the direction of darkness. We won't allow Iran's forces of darkness to win. Our security and the future of the Middle East require total victory. Total victory over Hamas can bring us additional gifts of peace. Our doctrine of peace through strength has already brought us the Abraham Accords. Total victory will help us bring more historical peace agreements. Hamas is the obstacle blocking a better and more peaceful Middle East, and it's threatening Israel's security. The pressure of the world should be on destroying Hamas as quickly as possible, and not on preventing Israel from doing so. All those who yearn for peace should support our quest for total victory. Total victory for our security, total victory for peace in the region, total victory to secure our common future.
Don't you wish we had a president like this? This is why Biden hates Netanyahu. This is why the enemies within our own country, the Hamas wing of the Democrat Party, Tlaib, Sanders, Omar, these lowlives, these anti-Semites, these Marxist anti-Americans. This is why the pages of the New York Times, which has blood on its hands, covering up the Holocaust, doing so on behalf of Franklin Roosevelt. This is why they trash Netanyahu left and right. Joe Biden, Joe Scarborough, the Biden whisperer, day in and day out trashes Bibi Netanyahu because he's strong, he's not weak. He won't capitulate. He stands up. And this is why I am furious with those Republicans who voted the other day, yesterday, to deny this commander-in-chief, the Churchill of our time, the ability to acquire munitions manufactured by Americans, by American companies in the United States, so that they can defend themselves and continue to do the heavy lifting with their flesh and blood. Because God knows Biden is funding the Iranians. He is worse than appeasing the Iranians. He's rearmed them. They're now attacking our troops. And I'm going to give you more on Blinken, the Alger Hiss part of Blinken, when we come back. I'll be right back.
Mark Levin.
I'm so tired.
The American media is so corrupt that if this particular media were around during World War II, I believe we would have lost to the Third Reich and the axis of evil. If Joe Biden were president then, I believe he would have sued for peace with the Third Reich, with Imperial Japan and fascistic Italy. Oh, I do. This crowd is worse than Neville Chamberlain. They're actually arming the enemy. They're funding the enemy while trying to starve our ally with the help of certain boneheads in Congress. I want to talk to you when we come back. As Tablet writes, Lee Smith, the great reporter, high-level Iranian spy ring busted in Washington. Well, what is that? What is that under our Secretary of State, Antony Blinken? Was he not aware of this? Was he not aware that they were backdooring us on nuclear discussions? Oh, he was well aware.